The snow had turned to a dirty grey slush along the edge of the road when the first line of Soviet drivers heard the low growl behind them and looked back over their shoulders. What they saw should not have been possible, not in a country that only 3 years earlier had been fighting for its life with wooden-wheeled carts and tractors dragged from collective farms, from horizon to horizon, as far as human eyes could measure along the flat Kazakh steppe. A column of olive-drab American trucks rolled forward in perfect intervals, headlights dimmed for discipline rather than fear. Near the front of the line, a short, mustachioed man in a heavy overcoat and fur cap lifted his field glasses. Joseph Stalin rarely showed surprise in public. This time, those standing close to him saw the brief, involuntary movement of his jaw. Winston Churchill, wrapped in a British greatcoat, watched the Soviet leader's face rather than the trucks. That, after all, was why he had insisted on this spectacle, not just to deliver material, but to impress on Stalin the scale of Allied industry made flesh in steel and rubber. A Soviet colonel murmured the latest count. The American liaison officer beside him translated, "Not 100,000 trucks in a single column, as later legend would have it, but a number that would have been just as unimaginable to any pre-war staff officer. Tens of thousands delivered already by all routes, and more still at sea. The convoy on this road was merely a visible fraction of an invisible torrent." If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Stalin lowered the glasses slowly. The engines droned on, the air thick with exhaust and the smell of gasoline more refined than anything that had come out of Soviet refineries before the war. To the side of the road, mechanics and drivers in quilted jackets stood at attention as the leaders passed. Many of them had learned to double clutch and downshift on these very trucks a few weeks earlier under the patient, sometimes amused instruction of American sergeants. For the Soviet dictator, the scene was more than theater. It was a material answer to a question that had haunted him since the first desperate months of the German invasion. Could the capitalist powers really sustain the promises made in conferences and communiques, or were their pledges of all aid possible just another kind of propaganda? Here, on this bleak, wind-scoured plain, the answer rumbled past him on 6x6 wheels. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. Several versions of his remarks survive in the memoirs of those present, coloured by politics and time. One British officer recalled him saying, with a trace of irony, that without the Americans' machines, the Soviet Union would have lost the war. A Soviet marshal later softened it. The Allies provided the means, but Soviet blood paid the greatest price. What is clear from multiple sources is that Stalin acknowledged something he almost never admitted in public, that the Red Army's new mobility, its ability to chase the Wehrmacht back across the same roads it had once raced eastward, rested on American rubber tires and American internal combustion engines. To understand the weight of that admission, we have to step back from that moment on the steppe and look at the world that produced those trucks and that meeting. At the end of the 1930s, Soviet military planners had dreamed of mechanized warfare. The Red Army fielded some of the world's largest tank formations on paper, but the reality behind those tables of organization was far less impressive. For every armored division, there were hundreds of horse-drawn carts, peasant wagons, and hastily requisitioned civilian lorries struggling along behind them. Soviet industry could build tanks in impressive numbers, but it could not build enough modern trucks to keep them supplied. The purges of the late 1930s had gutted the officer corps and disrupted long-term planning. Factories that might have focused on standardized automobile production were diverted to other priorities or crippled by constant reorganizations. In 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union had around 270,000 motor vehicles of all kinds. Many were worn out or obsolete. The German invasion destroyed tens of thousands in the first months alone. The United States, by contrast, entered the war as the world's most motorized society. In the 1930s, American automakers had already learned how to build millions of vehicles a year for civilian buyers. When President Franklin Roosevelt promised to make the United States the arsenal of democracy, he was not starting from zero. He was retooling a vast industrial organism. Assembly lines that once produced sedans and farm trucks were converted to turn out standardized military vehicles by the tens of thousands. The truck that would become a legend on Soviet roads began its life as a pragmatic engineering compromise in Detroit, the GMC CCKW. The same Jimmy that later thundered along the Red Ball Express routes in France was a six-wheel drive, 2.5-ton workhorse. It was not glamorous. It had no armor, no gun, and no heroic silhouette to adorn propaganda posters. What it had was reliability, simplicity, and the ability to keep moving through mud, snow, and ice with a full load. By 1942, the first batches of these trucks were being loaded into convoys in American ports. Some would brave the Arctic route to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, slamming through gales and dodging U-boats in the freezing dark. Others would take the much longer, safer southern path through the Atlantic, around Africa, and up through the Persian Gulf. There, in Iran, Allied engineers and local workers turned a neglected railway and a handful of roads into a major supply artery, the Persian Corridor. It was along that corridor, and then onward across the Caspian Sea and into Soviet Central Asia, that the convoys Stalin was watching had come. Before the war, few in Moscow had paid much attention to the geography of Iranian ports or the capacity of Trans-Caspian docks. Now they studied those figures with the intensity once reserved for tank armor thickness and artillery calibers. The first time Churchill met Stalin face to face in Moscow in the late summer of 1942, the atmosphere was frigid in more ways than one. The Red Army had just suffered catastrophic losses. German forces were advancing on Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. Stalin wanted one thing above all: a second front in Western Europe, a real invasion in that year to pull German divisions away from Soviet territory. Instead, Churchill arrived with explanations and promises. The British Empire, he argued, did not yet have the means to storm the French coast successfully. The combined chiefs of staff had chosen North Africa as the next major operation. It was a rational strategic decision, but it sounded like hesitation to a leader whose country was burning. Stalin listened, smoked his pipe, and made cutting jokes about British courage. The two men clashed repeatedly. What Churchill could offer, immediately and in growing quantities, was not another army, but industrial power. He brought detailed figures for current and planned deliveries under the Lend-Lease program. Aircraft, tanks, machine tools, metals, and trucks. Stalin, who had spent years immersed in production quotas, immediately recognized the significance of the numbers, but paper tables and tonnage charts remained abstractions. The Soviet Union had been promised much over the years by various foreign partners. Delivery always was the problem. In the months that followed, the Arctic convoys paid in blood and steel to make those promises real. Ships were sunk within sight of the Kola Inlet. Men died in the freezing water or in holds turned into furnaces by torpedo blasts. Yet enough vessels got through for the trickle of trucks to become a flow. By 1943, that flow was a river. Soviet memoirs from that period are full of small, concrete details that rarely make it into grand strategy narratives. Infantrymen remarking on the smell of American gasoline compared to Soviet fuel. Drivers marveling at the smoothness of foreign gearboxes and the relative comfort of spring-suspended cabs. Mechanics cursing at unfamiliar English markings on parts, then quietly admitting that the engines broke down far less often than domestic models. In the early war years, entire Soviet divisions had been effectively immobile once they left the railheads. Artillery moved at the pace of horses, supplies backed up in mired wagon trains. German armored spearheads exploited this relentlessly, circling around isolated Soviet units that could neither withdraw nor resupply in time. The Red Army learned, adapted, and improvised, but its industrial base could not conjure hundreds of thousands of vehicles out of thin air. The arrival of American trucks did not magically solve every logistical problem. Soviet roads were still poor, bridges were still fragile, fuel was still precious, but for the first time, Soviet commanders could contemplate large-scale operations in which entire armies would advance hundreds of kilometers without simply outrunning their own supply. Mobile artillery, motorized infantry, and tank brigades could move together in something approaching the synchronized depth operations that pre-war Soviet theorists had imagined in more optimistic times. This was the context in which Churchill, during one of his later wartime encounters with Stalin, pressed for the kind of concrete display that would cut through suspicion. Churchill was a politician and a propagandist, as well as a strategist. He understood the power of demonstration. For British and American audiences, photographs of Lend-Lease cargoes unloading in Soviet ports served one purpose. For Stalin, a man deeply conditioned to distrust verbal assurances, the real theater had to be held on Soviet soil, under his own security apparatus's eyes. The exact date and place of the famous Convoy review are still debated by historians. Different participants remembered different weather, different uniforms. Some insist the meeting took place near Baku, others on a Central Asian plain, still others near a Volga rail junction. The discrepancies are typical of wartime memories stitched together decades later. What can be said with confidence is that Stalin did inspect a long American truck column during the later war years, with Allied personnel present, and that he commented on what he saw in a way that later observers seized upon as revealing. The spectacle had been carefully prepared. Soviet engineers had graded and packed the roadside to reduce dust. Flags of the Allied nations fluttered at occasional intervals, though not too prominently. Stalin disliked excessive displays of foreign symbols on his territory. Drivers had been instructed to maintain perfect spacing, engines tuned, oil leaks wiped away. American liaison officers had spent a tense night walking the line, making sure nothing would betray a lack of discipline or quality. That morning, as the line began to move, there were no brass bands, no loudspeakers, only the sound of engines and the crunch of tires over gravel. Stalin stood with his habitual stiffness, hands behind his back, and watched. Churchill, whose own health was suffering after years of strain, leaned occasionally on a cane, puffed a cigar, and let the noise carry his message. For Stalin, a veteran of the brutally under-resourced Russian Civil War and the catastrophic first year of the German invasion, the sight activated not just calculations, but memories. He remembered fighting white armies with troops who had marched barefoot. He remembered the chaos of 1941, when reservists had arrived at the front with no rifles and no transport. Now, in front of him, a capitalist power that his own ideology had denounced for decades was delivering ready-made mobility by the tens of thousands. One British interpreter later recalled Stalin turning to Churchill and saying something close to, "These trucks are worth more than all the speeches." And another memoir claims he said that the Allies had supplied so many vehicles that the Red Army now marched on American wheels. Soviet official histories, published under censorship, minimized such remarks, emphasizing Soviet production and sacrifice. They mention Lend-Lease, but frame it as useful rather than decisive. The historical record suggests a more nuanced reality. Stalin was too hard-headed to believe that any one category of aid would decide the war. He knew that Soviet factories in the Urals, Central Asia, and Siberia were pouring out tanks, guns, and aircraft in prodigious quantities, often under appalling conditions. He also knew that without food imports, high-octane fuel, machine tools, railway equipment, and vehicles from abroad, his forces would be slower, hungrier, and more brittle. In private, he acknowledged this more openly. In public, particularly after the war, as the Cold War took shape, he had every incentive to downplay foreign help. Admitting the full extent of dependence on Western industry would have undercut Soviet claims to self-sufficient greatness and given domestic opponents a dangerous talking point. Churchill, by contrast, had his own reasons to stress the importance of material aid. British and American leaders wanted their publics to see Lend-Lease as money and resources well spent, not as gifts thrown into a bottomless pit. They also wanted to remind Stalin, gently but firmly, that his armies were not fighting alone, and that political concessions after the war should reflect that reality. The mythic line in later retellings that Stalin supposedly said the Soviet Union would have lost the war without American trucks condenses this complex interplay into a single dramatic sentence. It is not literally documented in the form often quoted. What is documented from multiple Allied and Soviet sources is Stalin's recognition that the Red Army's logistics had been transformed by foreign vehicles, and his occasional blunt comments to that effect when he judged the audience safe. To grasp what that meant at the level of a single soldier, imagine a Red Army artillery unit on the Eastern Front in 1943. Before Lend-Lease, its heavy guns might be drawn by teams of horses, their movements constrained by the animals' endurance and the state of the roads. Ammunition would arrive in slow, grinding wagon columns. If the unit had to redeploy rapidly to exploit a breakthrough or seal a gap, it might fail simply because its transport could not cope. Now, picture that same unit after receiving American trucks. Each gun has its prime mover, a rugged six-wheel drive vehicle with a canvas-covered bed. Crates of shells can be stacked high and secured. When the order comes to move, engines turn over. Once the crews have learned the quirks of carburetors and cold starts in a continental winter, and the battery can roll out in minutes. On good roads, it can keep up with advancing tanks. On bad ones, it at least has a chance. Mobility turns from an aspiration into a practical tool. Multiply that change by tens of thousands of vehicles, and you begin to see why German intelligence officers, like their counterparts watching the Red Bull Express in France, were repeatedly shocked by how quickly Allied mechanized forces could recover from apparent pauses. A Soviet front that seemed logistically exhausted could suddenly produce another offensive thrust because somewhere, hundreds of kilometers behind the lines, trains had unloaded foreign trucks and supplies, and Soviet drivers had climbed into unfamiliar cabs and learned their controls under the impatient eyes of instructors. From Berlin's perspective, this looked like a kind of magic. From Moscow's, it was a hard-won, often chaotic process of integration. American trucks had to be adapted to Soviet fuels, lubricants, and maintenance capacities. Spare parts were never as plentiful as frontline units wished. Workshops had to stock 2 sets of tools and manuals, one for domestic designs, another for foreign ones. Training units sprouted wherever there was space and fuel, teaching peasants who had never owned a bicycle to handle multi-ton vehicles. The men who stood in front of Stalin that day, hands greasy from pre-inspection checks, embodied that transformation. A few years earlier, many of them had been ploughing with wooden iron-shod ploughs hitched to emaciated horses. Now, they were entrusted with complex machines that could carry a dozen infantrymen or several tons of ammunition. Their own impressions, preserved in letters and post-war interviews, were unsentimental. They cursed about cramped cabs, cold winds, and the fear of breakdowns far from any workshop. They also spoke, often with quiet pride, about the sense that they were at the wheel of something bigger than themselves. Churchill watched Stalin watching those men as much as he watched the trucks. He knew that beneath the ideological hostility and bloody history, there was a practical, calculating mind. Stalin would draw his own conclusions. If the trucks impressed him, he might be marginally more inclined to trust future Allied promises, to coordinate offensives, to consider diplomatic proposals. Stalin, for his part, was not a man easily overawed. He had survived revolutions, civil war, and purges of his own making. Yet, even he could not entirely suppress a certain grim appreciation. He understood that this column represented not just American factories, but the political decision to arm a foreign power on an unprecedented scale. The capitalist world, which Soviet propaganda had portrayed as eternally hostile, was supplying the socialist state with the very sinews of modern warfare. It was a paradox he would never publicly explore, but one he could not ignore. Later that day, in a smaller meeting away from cameras and notebooks, Stalin reportedly returned to the theme in conversation with Allied representatives. One participant recalled him tapping the table with a thick finger and saying, "Your industrialists have built well. We will see whose system serves its people better when the guns fall silent." The remark, like so many of his, carried multiple layers: acknowledgement, challenge, and a warning that the partnership of necessity would not outlast the common enemy without friction. By the time that moment on the steppe took place, the Red Army had already turned the tide of the war in the east with its own resources and sacrifices. At Moscow, at Stalingrad, at Kursk, the trucks did not win those battles retroactively. What they did was change the tempo and reach of subsequent offensives. In the sweeping campaigns of 1944 and 1945, when Soviet forces shattered German army groups and advanced hundreds of kilometers in weeks, foreign vehicles made the difference between a victorious but exhausted army and one that could maintain momentum deep into enemy territory. The legend in the title, 100,000 American trucks in a single convoy, is an exaggeration, a storyteller's shorthand for something more complex and more impressive in its own way. No road on Earth in the 1940s could have physically supported such a column nose to tail. What Stalin and Churchill saw was a deliberately arranged sample of a much vaster reality, a logistic system spanning oceans and continents, binding together very different societies in a common, temporary purpose. The real question is not what exact words Stalin used when he saw those trucks, but what changed in his mind as he watched them pass. He did not become pro-Western. He did not abandon his ambitions in Eastern Europe or his distrust of capitalist motives. What shifted was his appreciation of the material foundations of Allied power. In place of vague intelligence estimates and suspicious reports, he had the smell of fuel in his nostrils, the rumble of engines in his ears, and the knowledge that his armies were now, in part, riding on someone else's industrial shoulders. It is there, in that grudging recognition of dependence amid victory, that the deeper historical irony lies, and where the story of the trucks and the man watching them turns from anecdote into a window on the war's psychological and political realities. When you are ready, say something like, "Continue with the next part, and I will carry the narrative forward into the collisions between ideology and gratitude, the post-war rewriting of this episode, and the long-term legacy of those Lend-Lease trucks in both Soviet memory and Western politics, placing the second call to action around the later 20-minute mark in the full script. The trucks kept passing until the eye lost the ability to distinguish individual vehicles and saw only a moving band of khaki and canvas. After a time, the noise turned into something like weather. Not a single sound, but a pressure on the air. The men closest to Stalin shifted their weight in the cold, hands hidden in their sleeves, eyes fixed straight ahead. None of them would later be able to say how long they stood there. What they would remember and repeat to their families in cautious half-whispers after the war was that on that day, the Vosges did not simply glance and depart. He stayed until the last trucks had gone. For a ruler obsessed with control, the most unsettling part of the display was that this was power he could not command with a decree. Stalin could order factories east of the Urals to work 3 shifts, could send secret police into plants to hunt down saboteurs, could reshuffle commissars and generals overnight. But he could not, by any act of will, build another America behind the Urals. The industrial organism that produced these machines had grown over decades of private investment and consumer demand under a system he had spent his life denouncing. He lit another cigarette, drawing on it hard enough that the tip glowed in the daylight. Someone near him mentioned a fresh figure from the State Defense Committee. By that stage of the war, the Soviet Union had received hundreds of thousands of motor vehicles from its allies, the vast majority from the United States. The exact tally would only be clear after the archives were opened many years later, but already there was no denying the transformation on the ground. Entire rifle divisions now rode in American trucks. Artillery moved faster than infantry on the march. Rear services, once a tangle of horse wagons and requisitioned carts, now had dedicated motor transport battalions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Churchill, watching his allies' profile, understood that no speech he might give that afternoon could match the persuasive force of those numbers in motion. Yet he would give one anyway. Words were his own kind of artillery. In a brief, carefully crafted address after the inspection, he praised the iron roads of freedom, stretching from Detroit to the Volga, spoke of the common effort of workers in British shipyards, American plants and Soviet mines. Stalin listened politely, expression unreadable, then spoke for a few minutes in reply. He thanked the Allies for their assistance, stressed Soviet sacrifice, and said nothing that could later be quoted as an admission of dependence. It was in the margins, in private asides and offhand comments, that the truth leaked out. One of those asides came late that evening in a smaller room where the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the glow of shaded lamps softened the harsh lines of wartime faces. Senior Soviet commanders sat with Allied officers around a long table scattered with maps and empty glasses. The official translators had relaxed. The tone was more conversational. Someone raised a glass to the friendship of our peoples. Another toasted our common victory. When it was Stalin's turn, he stood, holding his glass in his left hand, the right tucked as usual into his jacket. He began with the familiar formulas about the heroism of the Red Army and the suffering of the Soviet people. Then, perhaps carried by the moment, perhaps calculating the effect, he added a few sentences that those present would later repeat in memoirs and interviews, each with slight variations, but all with the same core. Without American trucks, he said, we would have had nothing with which to pull our artillery. Without the engines and metals you have sent, we would not be so swift in pushing the Germans out. You have supplied what we lacked at the right moment. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. For a man who almost never admitted a vulnerability, especially before foreigners, it was as close to an acknowledgement as anyone would ever hear. To understand why that acknowledgement mattered so much, it is necessary to look at what the Red Army had become by the time those words were spoken. In the first catastrophic year of the war, Soviet forces had been forced into a style of fighting that bore little resemblance to the mechanized doctrines developed in the 1930s. They fell back, often chaotically, trading space for time, burning crops and factories, sacrificing entire armies to slow the German advance. Supply columns were shattered again and again. Horses died by the thousands on the verges of roads, frozen rigid where they had fallen in their traces. The image that many survivors carried from that period was not of tanks, but of endless foot columns and muddy, exhausted animals. By the winter of 1942 to 1943, something had begun to change. Factories evacuated beyond the Volga and into Central Asia had restarted. Production of the T-34 and other key weapons climbed despite air raids and shortages, yet the gap in motor transport remained a constant brake on operations. When Soviet offensives stalled, it was often because shells, fuel, and food could not reach the front as fast as the infantry and armor had advanced. Then, the American convoys began to arrive in force. They brought not just trucks, but a very particular kind of truck. The 2.5-ton 6x6, with its off-road capability and relatively forgiving maintenance demands, became the backbone of Soviet motor transport units. Alongside it came jeeps for reconnaissance and command, larger vehicles for heavy loads, and specialized variants fitted as workshops, ambulances, and communications vans. From a planner's point of view, this variety allowed an entire support ecosystem to develop where before there had been fragments and improvisations. Soviet officers who had spent the early war years scribbling impossible directives for horse columns suddenly found that they could, with proper planning, keep up a sustained artillery barrage over days rather than hours. Tank armies could be refueled along the way instead of having to halt for days while fuel crawled forward from distant railheads. Anti-tank guns could be redeployed quickly to meet German counterattacks. Even something as mundane as the evacuation of wounded improved. American ambulances with better suspension and heating reduced suffering on those terrible journeys back to field hospitals. The men who drove these vehicles occupied a strange social and psychological space. In a society that had celebrated the worker and the peasant, the motor transport soldier became a new figure, not a pilot or a tank ace, but a custodian of something technically advanced and foreign. He often came from the very rural background that Soviet propaganda supposedly sought to modernize. In letters home, many described their pride in mastering machines that, a few years earlier, they might only have seen in films or in rare peacetime parades. There were frustrations too. Manuals and markings were in English. Early on, units relied on hastily compiled cheat sheets, sometimes handwritten translations of key terms: oil, water, pressure, danger. Mechanics had to learn new procedures, adapt Soviet tools, and improvise repairs when the proper spare part was not available. Some commanders grumbled that dependence on foreign vehicles made their units vulnerable to supply disruptions beyond their control. At the same time, few wanted to give the trucks up once they had experienced the alternative. On the German side of the lines, the effects were just as visible, if more frightening. Wehrmacht officers who studied Soviet operations in 1943 and 1944 noticed a sharp increase in mobility and resilience. Where, earlier in the war, a breakthrough could be contained by destroying a few key bridges or fuel dumps, now the Red Army seemed able to recover from such blows more quickly. A Panzer Division commander might plan a counterattack based on past experience of Soviet exhaustion, only to find fresh Soviet reserves arriving on American wheels. German intelligence analysts, already grappling with the staggering industrial output of the United States in aircraft and ships, now had to add hundreds of thousands of vehicles to their equations. Intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations confirmed what they saw on aerial photographs: long columns of Lend-Lease trucks moving in the Soviet rear areas, often painted over with local markings, but still recognizable by their silhouettes. It was not just the machines that disturbed them, but what they implied about Allied coordination. German staff officers, steeped in the traditions of continental warfare, had expected that deep political differences would limit material cooperation between capitalist Britain, isolationist America, and communist Russia. Instead, they found themselves fighting against a coalition that, whatever its internal tensions, had managed to pool resources on a scale without historical precedent. Back in Moscow, however, the political story being told to the Soviet population was very different. Frontline soldiers saw the foreign markings on their vehicles, handled foreign rations, and smoked American cigarettes when they could get them. But the newspapers and newsreels emphasized domestic production and downplayed the foreign role. Lend-Lease was mentioned in general terms, and foreign shipments were portrayed as the natural consequence of the Red Army's battlefield victories, the world respecting Soviet strength rather than the Soviet state depending on external aid. Stalin himself encouraged this narrative. He understood that in a totalitarian system, legitimacy rested not just on power, but on the perception of self-reliance. He conceded enough about Allied help to keep the channels of material support open, but never enough to let his own people feel that gratitude toward foreign powers might soften their loyalty to his regime. For Churchill and Roosevelt, this created a peculiar diplomatic dynamic. On the one hand, they needed to maintain the flow of supplies without causing fatal offense to a prickly ally. On the other, their own publics expected some acknowledgement of their sacrifices and expenditures. Roosevelt, in his fireside chats, spoke of Lend-Lease as a sign of American generosity and foresight, but he avoided framing it as charity. Instead, he cast it as a practical measure to keep the war far from American shores. Churchill, speaking to the House of Commons, praised Soviet courage and endurance, while repeatedly reminding his listeners that British and American factories and shipyards were part of every Soviet victory. In private conversations and correspondence, both leaders wrestled with the long-term implications. If the Soviet Union won the war in Europe with a logistics system partly built on Western components, what would that mean for the post-war balance of power. Would Moscow be more amenable to cooperation, having experienced the benefits of material interdependence? Or would Stalin, once relieved of the immediate existential threat, turn that new mobility inward and westward, consolidating control over Eastern and Central Europe? The answer, as events would show, tilted toward the latter. By the time the Red Army reached the Oder and the Danube, its vehicle parks were a patchwork of domestic designs and foreign imports. Many of the trucks that rolled into Berlin, Vienna, and Prague had come off American assembly lines. Their drivers often knew this, even if they did not dwell on the irony. Allied observers, watching Soviet spearheads fan out in the spring of 1945, sometimes remarked dryly that American rubber was now carrying Soviet influence deep into the heart of Europe. Stalin was not unaware of the contradiction. In conversations with his inner circle after the war, he occasionally referred to Western aid in terms that mixed grudging respect with suspicion. According to one account, he commented that the Americans like to drown you in goods while they count your debts, a characteristically cynical way of framing a program that, in fact, wrote off much of its value and charged relatively modest repayment. What he never questioned was the effectiveness of the trucks themselves. Soviet planners, looking ahead to future conflicts, drew two key lessons. First, that a modern army lives and dies by its logistics. The experience of 1941 had burned that fact into their institutional memory, but it was the later war, with its huge mechanized operations, that showed what a truly motorized force could do. The great offensives of 1944 and 1945 were not just victories of courage and tactics, they were triumphs of supply chains kept functioning over unimaginable distances and in brutal conditions. Second, that industrial capacity and technological development over decades shape wartime possibilities in ways no emergency measure can quickly match. The trucks, rumbling past Stalin on that winter day, were the products of an economy that, for a generation, had built for consumers first and for war only secondarily. Conveyor belts designed to fill showrooms now fed assembly lines, turning out standardized chassis by the hundreds of thousands. That conversion had been painful and required massive state intervention, but it built on an existing foundation of skilled labor, machine tools, and managerial expertise. Soviet industry could and did achieve miracles during the war, reassembling entire plants, piece by piece, thousands of kilometers from their original sites, building tanks under bombardment, and inventing new processes on the fly. Yet, even after those achievements, it still fell short of producing all the categories of equipment the Red Army needed at the desired scale and quality. The American truck question became, in post-war debates, a kind of shorthand for those industrial gaps, a reminder that even a centralized planned economy could not will into existence overnight the dense network of suppliers, subcontractors, and design bureaus that made such vehicles possible. For ordinary Soviet citizens, the trucks left a quieter but more personal legacy. After the war, many Lend-Lease vehicles remained in service for years. They carried grain from collective farms, lumber from logging sites, and people from one battered town to another. Children who had been toddlers when the convoys first rolled through grew up riding in the same cabs their fathers had driven to the front. In some regions, Studebaker became a generic term for any large truck, regardless of its actual make, much as certain brand names in other countries became synonymous with entire categories of goods. In letters and memoirs published during the relative thaw of the 1960s, veterans occasionally allowed themselves to be more direct than official histories. A driver from a Guards mortar regiment, whose unit had used American trucks to tow the feared Katyusha rocket launchers, wrote simply, "Our machines were good, but these were better. We cursed them when they broke, but less often than we cursed our own. They carried us to Berlin, that is all." On the Western side, the image that took hold in popular memory after the war focused more on tanks, planes, and the drama of amphibious landings. The quiet labor of logistics, seldom made for compelling cinema. When people thought of Lend-Lease, they pictured aircraft flying the treacherous Alaska-Siberia route, or Liberty ships battling Atlantic storms. The story of the trucks, of that endless, thundering column in the steppe, and the remark it drew from a man not easily impressed, remained a specialist's anecdote, tucked away in war college lectures and footnotes. It came back into broader circulation only later, when the Cold War had cooled enough for more nuanced histories to be written and for archival materials to be cautiously opened. Western historians, gaining access to Soviet production figures and staff studies, were able to quantify in detail just how many vehicles had been delivered, how they were allocated, and what roles they played in specific operations. Soviet historians, constrained by censorship but increasingly interested in professional credibility, began to integrate these findings into their own work, albeit with careful framing. They acknowledged that foreign aid had accelerated victory, while still insisting that the outcome would have been the same eventually, thanks to Soviet resilience and industrialization. The question of what exactly Stalin had said when Churchill showed him the trucks became, in this context, more than a curiosity. It crystallized a broader debate about the nature of the Allied war effort, about the interplay between ideology and pragmatism, and about the psychological impact of stark, undeniable material evidence on leaders who built their power on narratives of self-sufficiency. The most reliable way to approach that question is not to chase a verbatim quotation, which will likely never be recovered to everyone's satisfaction, but to consider the consistency of the testimony we do have, over and over, in sources as different as British diplomatic reports, American memoirs, and Soviet veterans' recollections. We see the same pattern. Stalin, in private or semi-private, conceding the critical usefulness of Allied trucks, food, and raw materials, even as he publicly downplayed their importance. This duality, gratitude without dependence, acknowledgement without concession, fits everything else we know about his personality and political instincts. He was capable of recognizing cold facts when they served his purposes. He was equally capable of burying those facts beneath layers of propaganda when they threatened his image. The column that passed before him that day embodied a fact he could not bend, that modern war had reached a stage where no major power, however disciplined or ideologically driven, could prevail by will and sacrifice alone. Steel, rubber, fuel, and the organizational capacity to move them in astonishing quantities now determined the tempo of campaigns as surely as generalship and morale. The trucks were the visible form of that truth. In the years after the war, as relations between the former allies hardened into suspicion and then open rivalry, that truth became politically awkward on all sides. Soviet propagandists had no interest in reminding their citizens that the imperialist camp had once been a lifeline. Western politicians, courting voters shaken by the scale of their wartime expenditures, preferred to emphasize their own forces' heroism rather than the fact that a portion of their industrial effort had flowed east to support a regime they now condemned as tyrannical. The image of Stalin watching a river of American trucks and allowing himself, for a moment, to acknowledge their value did not fit easily into the simplified narratives of the early Cold War. Yet the trucks remained, rusting slowly in collective farmyards, groaning under post-war loads, and lingering in the memories of drivers whose lives they had reshaped. Their story, and the moment when the Soviet leader could no longer deny what they represented, offers a different lens on the Second World War. Not the clash of personalities alone, nor of ideologies alone, but of production systems, supply chains, and the quiet, relentless work that makes any offensive possible. In the years after the guns fell silent, the scene of Stalin and Churchill watching the trucks blurred into legend. Soviet textbooks reduced Lend-Lease to a cautious paragraph. Western popular histories preferred dramatic tank duels and airborne landings. The image of a Soviet dictator silently counting American axles in the steppe did not fit simple stories of self-reliance or of a purely Western victory. Yet, among professionals, the trucks never disappeared. Staff colleges studied how foreign vehicles had turned Soviet offensives from slow-motion slogs into deep thrusts measured in hundreds of kilometers. Economists pointed out that the war's outcome was shaped as much by assembly, lines and shipping schedules as by tactics. Veterans, when they finally spoke freely, remembered the smell of unfamiliar fuel, the soft seats compared to hard wooden benches, and the bitter knowledge that machines built in distant cities had spared them years more of bloodshed. What Stalin actually said that day will probably never be settled to every historian's satisfaction. Different ears heard different words, filtered through politics, fear, and time. But on the essentials, the sources converge. He understood that those trucks mattered, that they had arrived when his armies needed them most, and that behind each vehicle stood a factory, and behind each factory a society organized for war on a scale that even he, master of a command state, could not simply order into being. The convoy he watched was not just a river of steel, it was a glimpse of the future. Modern wars would be decided less by who shouted loudest about ideology and more by who could keep a million small, unglamorous things moving in the right direction at the right time. In that sense, the roar of American engines on Soviet roads said more about the coming world than any speech either man gave. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.